Thank you for joining us around the fire. For more information or to make a donation, please visit randomactsnetwork.com. Now, want to hear a scary story?
Ricky and his friends were telling the new boy in the neighborhood about the strange old hermit who lived outside of town. "He's crazy," Ricky said. The other boys nodded. "He lives in a shack over on Collins Peak." "A shack?" asked Kurt, the new boy. "I swear," said Ricky, holding up his hand. "It's true," added Steve, Ricky's best friend. "He built it against the side of the mountain with old pieces of metal and wood." Kurt shook his head. "That's weird. Who is this guy?" Some of the boys shrugged. "His name is Collins. He's lived up there forever, as long as anybody can remember. That's why they call it Collins Peak," said Sean. "My grandma told me once that he had a sad story," said Nathan, "but that's all she'd say." "It's a sad story, all right," agreed Ricky. "He's a crazy old man who lives in a shack." The rest of the boys laughed. "What does he do up there?" asked Kurt. "Nothing," replied Ricky. "He never talks to anyone, never comes into town." "We think he eats kids," said Steve. "It's true. He hates kids," said Ricky. "Everyone at school knows it. His shack's at the end of a big field, and anytime someone sets foot on it, he comes screaming out of nowhere. He pulled his head down between his shoulders and limped around in a circle." Everyone laughed at that. "Sometimes we dare each other to see who can get the closest to his shack before he comes charging out," continued Ricky. "Why do you say he eats kids?" asked Kurt. "Well," said Ricky, his voice dropping lower as he leaned toward Kurt, "you never know where he is. He sneaks all over these hills, waiting for some kid to do something stupid, like wander in alone. Then, it's all over." "What happens?" Kurt asked. "He'll trap that kid, take him back to his shack, where he cooks him slowly over a fire. Then he stores the blackened body carefully so it'll last him for the next couple meals. There's a pit nearby that's filled with all the rotten bones of every kid who's ever disappeared around here." Kurt looked at Ricky suspiciously. "And how many kids is that?" Ricky shrugged. "Don't know, but you better be careful, or you'll be one of them." At that moment, Sean grabbed Kurt from behind and yelled, "Gotcha!" Kurt squealed and jumped, and the rest of the boys howled with laughter. "Rotten bones, yeah, right," Kurt smiled and shook his head. "Okay, you got me. Who knows why he really doesn't want us around his stupid shack," Nathan said after the boys recovered. "Maybe he's got some kind of hidden treasure there. He's been living in the hills for ages. Who knows what he's found? Maybe it's some kind of gold mine." "Then why doesn't he spend a lot of money?" demanded Sean. "Maybe because he knows people would come up there and kick him out," guessed Steve. "Maybe he had a partner and killed him to keep the gold for himself," Kurt suggested. They spent the rest of the afternoon making up wild stories about the old man. That night, Kurt asked his parents if they had heard about the hermit. His father shook his head, but his mother nodded that she had heard something once. "Mrs. Beecham was telling me about him," she explained. "He used to live in town a long time ago. His wife died giving birth to their only son. Then a few years later, his son disappeared. Apparently, he went a little crazy after that. He built some kind of house up on Collins Peak, and he's lived there ever since." "I hadn't heard that," Kurt's father said. "Is he supposed to be dangerous?" Mrs. Beecham didn't think so. She said he'd lived down there longer than most of the people have in this town. He's never hurt anybody. "Ricky was telling me that he hates kids and chases them away whenever they come near his shack," said Kurt. His father laughed. "I can see it now. Some poor old guy living up in the hills. He must be target for every kid within 100 miles. He turned to Kurt. I'm sure Ricky is right. This guy has probably been pestered by kids ever since he moved there. Why don't you just leave him in peace, okay? Kurt shrugged. Sure, Dad. He bent over his plate and paid close attention to his dinner. The next day, he couldn't wait to talk to his new friends. They all met at Steve's house, and Kurt filled them in on what his mother had told him. See, said Ricky, that just proves it. He probably hates kids because he lost his son. Let's show Kurt the shack, suggested Sean. I don't know, Kurt said. My dad said I should leave the old man alone. I think he feels sorry for him. Don't worry, said Ricky. We'll only go as far as the edge of the field. That way you can see what we're talking about. Kurt pretended to resist, but was soon heading out of town to Collins Peak with the rest of the boys. They walked to the end of Adler Road, which turned into a dirt trail winding its way into the foothills. Ricky led them to a point where the trail began to bend around the mountain. Just up around that bend, he said to Kurt in a low voice, is the old man's field. When we get there, look toward the far end and you'll see his shack. They crept along the trail and gradually a field was revealed. It lay to the right of the trail and was surrounded on 3 sides by steep slopes. It was about as big as a football field, and at the far end stood the hermit's shack. To Kurt, it looked as if the shack were crouched under the oak trees, waiting to pounce on an unsuspecting child. He had no idea how it was held together. There were all different kinds and sizes of metal sheets, aluminum siding, wooden planks, and pieces of plastic. It was hunched up against the side of the mountain, as if any minute it would push against the hill so as to lunge forward all the better. He lives there? Kurt asked in disbelief. That's right, said Ricky. Nice place, huh? Suddenly the door of the shack swung open, and the old man rushed out. Kurt figured he must be more than 100 years old. His body was thin, and his bones poked through the holes in his ragged clothes. He had long white hair that stuck straight out and a scraggly beard that hung down to his chest. He looked anxiously around the clearing. The boys shrunk back into the bushes, peeking through the branches. Kurt felt as if the old man were looking straight at him. But nothing happened. The hermit began coughing, and even from where they were, Kurt could hear that horrible gasping. Then the old man ducked back into his hut. Ricky motioned to the others and they backed away down the trail. Once out of sight of the field, they ran all the way back to Adler Road. Then they stumbled to a halt, their chests heaving. See, said Nathan, he is one strange-looking old man. It sounded like he was about to die, Ricky said. They spent the rest of the day playing hide-and-seek in the overgrown weeds and bushes near the end of Adler Road. One morning, a few weeks later, Kurt was eating his breakfast when the doorbell rang. I got it, he yelled, and ran to the front door. It was Sean. After letting him in, they went up to his room. Guess what happened last night when Mr. Grafton was walking his dog? How should I know? Kurt asked, lacing up his shoes. What's going on? Mr. Grafton was walking that goofy German shepherd of his up around Adler Rove when the dog started going crazy. So Grafton lets the dog go and it runs over to some bushes and starts barking. Yeah, Kurt asked. He forgot about tying his other shoe. What was it? The old man. He had some kind of heart attack or something. So Grafton got the police and an ambulance up there and they took the old man to the hospital. Wow. How do you know all this? Asked Kurt. Sean practically did a dance. My sister works at the hospital. She told us this morning at breakfast. Is he dead? Nah, but you know what this means. What? Asked Kurt. It means, said Sean, becoming very serious, that for the first time I can remember, the old man is not at his shack. Kurt realized what Sean was suggesting and started to protest. Come on, Sean interrupted. Ricky, Steve, and Nathan are going to meet us at Adler Road. Kurt stood up, chewing his lip while he thought. Sean watched. Then Kurt grinned and threw his arms in the air like a champion boxer. Let's go. The old man was dying, and he knew it. He opened his eyes and stared at the white walls of the hospital room. He hadn't been in a hospital since his son was born. He turned slowly and looked at the tube in his arm, smiling bitterly. There was no use, but try and tell that to a doctor. Yes, he knew he was dying. He had known it since the coughing began, nearly 6 months ago. First, he thought he had a slight cold, or maybe bronchitis at the worst. But the cough never went away. After the first couple of weeks, it felt like his chest was being ripped apart every time he coughed. And not long after that, he had started coughing up blood. He felt himself falling asleep again. He was so tired. Then he remembered. The cave. He had to tell someone about the cave. He struggled to pull himself into a sitting position and reached for the nurse's bell. Ricky, Nathan, and Steve were already at the end of Adler Road by the time Sean and Kurt got there. Ricky showed the others his Swiss Army knife. "What's that for?" asked Kurt. "Be prepared," intoned Ricky. "That's the Scout motto." Steve rolled his eyes. "Great. We'll call you if we need a fish scaled. Now let's get going." They started up the road. Soon they got to the trail that led up the foothills and to the old man's shack. With mounting excitement, they continued. The nurse ran into the room. "Mr. Collins," she said, pulling his fingers off the bell. "What's the matter?" He grabbed at her wrist and tried to talk, but he felt that sharp, familiar feeling in his chest and began coughing. Only this time he couldn't stop. He held on to the nurse as his body shook and flecks of blood sprayed from his mouth. "Mr. Collins," she said, frightened. "Mr. Collins, let me get the doctor." He shook his head, and with a huge effort he forced himself to stop. "No," he gasped. "Wait. My hut. The cave." He blacked out for a moment, and the nurse hit the intercom asking for a doctor. The boys reached the field and marched bravely toward the far end. As they got closer to the shack, some of their courage leaked away, and they moved slower. "What if he's been released?" asked Kurt. "No way," said Sean. "My sister said they'll have to monitor him for at least 24 hours. "But what if someone else is in there?" whispered Steve. They stopped a few feet in front of the shack. "Hello?" called Ricky. "Anyone home?" They waited, their nerves on edge, but all was silent. The one window of the shack was dark and empty. "Come on," said Ricky suddenly. He strode forward before the others could react and pulled open the door. They all braced themselves for some kind of howling demon to rush out and devour Ricky, but nothing happened. The other boys edged closer. "Hey," said Ricky, "look at that." Kurt couldn't believe it. The back wall of the shack had a door in it, yet the back wall was up against the hillside. "You see?" said Nathan proudly. "I was right. He did find a gold mine." The rest of the hut was quickly examined and judged worthless. There was nothing in it but an old chest of drawers with some scraps of clothing, a small table and a bed. A bowl with some shriveled fruit sat on the table. Ricky positioned himself in front of the back door. It had a bar across it that could easily be lifted off. He looked at the other boys. "Ready, gentlemen?" Old Man Collins swung his mind out of the blackness. The nurse was there, explaining to the doctor why she called him. The doctor leaned over him. "Mr. Collins," he said gently, "you're in pretty bad shape." "My hut," he gasped. "Your hut will be fine," the doctor tried to calm him. "Please try to relax." Mr. Collins grabbed at the doctor's arm, but his strength failed him. He began coughing again. This time, he felt something tear in his chest. And after a sharp pain, there was nothing. His vision grew dimmer, and his hand slipped from the doctor's arm. He was no longer in the hospital room. Instead, he floated over the field where his hut stood. Then he was inside the hut, watching as the boys approached the back door. "Ready, gentlemen?" he heard one of the boys say. The boy grabbed the bar across the back door. "No!" he yelled. "Get away from there!" But they couldn't hear him. The boy slid the bar to the side and threw open the door. Behind the door was the dark mouth of a cave. "No, stay away!" the old man yelled again, but it was no use. As one, the boys pushed forward to peer inside. Then each one of them felt an invisible force grab at them with terrible strength and pull them deeper inside the cave. "No!" screamed Mr. Collins with all his might. It was the last thing he ever said. "What was he yelling about, Doctor?" the nurse asked as she looked down at the dead body of Mr. Collins. "Delirium," said the doctor. "Who knows what they see just before they go?"